So our next panel is called Expanding Pedagogic Practice, New Methods and Approaches. So let's get started. First up, we have Erika Kvistad. So Erika is Associate Professor of English at the University of South-East Norway, where she teaches English. Her PhD is on sexual power dynamics in Charlotte Bronte, and she has previously published on sexual consent negotiation as a textual and cultural phenomenon. Domestic spaces in Victorian horror, and the idea of the monstrous in university pedagogy. Current work is on digital haunted houses, which sounds right up my particular street. Erika's paper is titled Horror and Aesthetic Learning in EFL Teacher Education. So whenever you're ready, Erika, off you go.
Perfect. Everyone seeing this okay?
Yep, see it perfect.
Excellent. Okay, thanks so much for being here, everyone. This has been so interesting so far. So as is probably kind of clear from my bio, I'm kind of coming at this from a slightly different perspective than I think most people here, in that I'm kind of fundamentally a literature person. What I'm going to be talking about today, horror as an element in EFL teacher students aesthetic education, will kind of span the border between screen media and non-screen media, in that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is kind of the shaping of traditional literary analytical skills, but I'm going to be doing it through a discussion of digital narrative and especially interactive fiction. So when I say text or literature, just please imagine like the widest possible sense of those words. This is also pretty early stage work for me. I'm building kind of more on like reflection and observation here than on any kind of empirical classroom research. So this is all stuff I'm hoping to explore more in the future. So, sorry to kind of put this thing right in everyone's faces. In my abstract, I say that horror and teacher education are kind of an uneasy fit, and maybe that's maybe the reasons for that are fairly obvious. I think young people's and children's relationship to horror media is obviously something that adults have historically worried about a lot. In the 90s, in educational research, you find a lot of concern about goosebumps in particular. And more recently, this kind of centered more on digital horror aimed at young people, like the Momo phenomenon of a few years ago. So what am I doing when I work with my teacher students on horror? So just to kind of situate us a bit, I teach English at a university in Norway. Most of the students I work with are learning how to teach English as a foreign language to kids between about ages 6 and 15. So like me, most but not all of my students have Norwegian as a first language and English as a second language. And literature and other narrative media play a very weird role in EFL teacher education, in that it's at once a really important factor, and it is also very hard to do well. Some of this is just kind of a matter of time and focus, in the sense that because EFL is so incredibly interdisciplinary, teacher students have to develop all kinds of different kinds of theoretical knowledge, as well as obviously a lot of practical skills. So learning to engage deeply and critically with narrative media is something that takes a lot of time, as we all know. But it's just one of the many things that you are meant to learn in a teacher education program. And of course, students also start out from really different places. You can be a very dedicated teacher student without having started out as a passionate reader of literature. So over the last few years, I've been kind of experimenting with ways of getting more students more into literature. So in the sense that they enjoy it and they want to work with it, but also in the sense that they develop their skills at thinking critically about literature as literature. And increasingly, I'm starting to feel like the pathway to this is effective. So in literary study, obviously feelings are kind of the material we work with, in that if we don't have the ability to access and to understand our emotional or affective or aesthetic responses to a text, even if that response isn't positive or even especially powerful, engaging with it critically becomes much harder. But it's actually only recently that I've started to see affective and aesthetic response as actually explicitly a way into critical understanding. And some of this for me came from reading Glenna Sloan's early work. This is from like the 60s or 70s, on how young readers first learn to engage with literature, her work, The Child as Critic, where she divides this process into two stages: the aesthetic and affective experience and critical understanding. So in order to become critics, and as her title suggests, for Sloan, this is something that is both possible and desirable for students at all levels, including small children. We need to have a lot of feelings first. And that puts us kind of in a tricky position because the university isn't necessarily a great place to have a lot of feelings. So almost every semester, for instance, I get students asking me if it's okay to use the word I in a literary critical essay. And obviously that's kind of a disciplinary convention thing, but I think it also suggests the extent to which academic writing, the kind of work our students get assessed on, is by default something that obviates the personal. And also I think classroom spaces, even when we work hard and succeed in making them feel safe and relaxed, are also kind of by default like that. So encouraging effective responses in this setting does require some effort. And I think that brings us to horror. So affect obviously is at the heart of horror. Javier Aldana Reyes distinguishes between horror and the Gothic by saying that horror is a genre named after the emotions it intends to generate. And the way into this that I especially like is, of course, Linda Williams's discussion of body genres. The body genres she discusses are, of course, melodrama, pornography, and horror. And how these are genres that evoke involuntary physical responses in the audience that mirror the ones in the narrative. So tears, arousal, flinching, shuddering, screaming. So the audience's response to horror is not only emotional, but it's physical and empathetic. And of course, it's also often intensely personal, which is something that's kind of come up over and over again today. I think one place where we see this beautifully is in Freud's essay on the uncanny, which, as he says, is about aesthetics understood as the theory of the qualities of feeling. In this case, the feeling of fear. There is, of course, a universality to the feeling he describes, but I think his explication ends up being incredibly personally revealing. It's a text where, you know, for better or worse, you really get to know Freud. So when I work with horror in teacher education, as a lot of you have said earlier, I'm not always drawing on this aspect of it. I'm more kind of plugging it in wherever it works. So in my classes, you know, we talk about the Gothic as a way of understanding genre. We look at creepypasta and Twitter horror as a way into the affordances of digital narratives. We work on interactive horror fiction as a way of studying nonlinear storytelling. We learn about the uncanny as a literary theoretical approach. And all of these are kind of things that you could also just use another genre for, if that was what you were interested in. But increasingly, I'm seeing the value of drawing on the affective element of horror specifically. And part of what has kind of nudged me into this is that I've been teaching the concept of the uncanny a few times in different settings over the past years. And usually part of this is that part of what I do is I ask students to bring in something that they find uncanny. And I'm always sort of very specific that, you know, this can be a piece of media, because I don't want people to feel like they have to share anything especially personal. That's not necessarily what the assignment is about. But almost invariably, that is what people do. They bring in things that are close to home in various ways. They talk about, you know, a childhood toy they had that took on a monstrous quality, or unsettling stories they heard from their parents or grandparents, or weird events in a former home, or recurring nightmares or something weird that happened in their small town. So we start to get this kind of campfire atmosphere where people are sort of delighting and scaring each other a little bit with their stories. We are kind of sharing in a feeling. And this isn't something I've studied in a formal way at this point, but my impression is that tapping into this kind of, sorry, let me just make sure everything is okay here. Yep, seems like it. So yeah, my impression is that tapping into this kind of effective and very first person, but also shared aesthetic experience is often something that encourages or opens up effective and aesthetic responses to class texts. So I would now like to just look a little bit at how particular kinds of texts can facilitate this kind of engagement. And what I'm going to look at in particular is a genre that I often work with in class, which is interactive horror fiction. So I don't know how many people are especially into interactive fiction here. It's a genre of text-based choose your own adventure games, usually written in the second person, where you make choices in order to move through the narrative. And these kinds of narratives absolutely predate the internet, for instance, in the form of actual kind of analog choose your own adventure books, like the one we have an image of here. But obviously they've really flourished in digital form for many decades. And over the last decade, a big shift in IF has been the development of Twine, which is an open source tool that makes it possible to write IF without having a lot of programming experience to begin with. So it's something that makes it very accessible. And so Twine and other similar tools have kind of created a new wave of indie IF games, which are often by LGBT creators, that focus on emotional experiences more than on external action. And a lot of these are, in one way or another, horror games. So sometimes the emotional experience where investigating is joyful defiance in the face of utter destruction, as in Anna Anthropy's Queers in Love at the End of the World, which we see an image from here. Sometimes it's, isolation, intimate horror, sense of creeping complicity, as in Porpentine's With Those We Love Alive. Sometimes it might be frustration and anxiety and powerlessness, as in Ella Risbridger's Blood Will Out. Some of these games have been called empathy games, in the sense that they aim to simulate a particular inner experience for the player. And this is obviously a really controversial concept in all kinds of ways. Playing games like reading fiction can maybe foster empathy, but it cannot really exactly make us know what it's like to be someone else. This is something that Anna Anthropy, for instance, has talked about a lot in response to the idea that her game Dysphoria lets players sort of know what it's like to be a trans woman. But unquestionably, IF can do a lot to pull you emotionally into its storytelling. This is stuff that is happening to you, the player avatar. You get to respond to and to make choices about what happens. And the game is continually using textual and mechanical techniques to make you feel things. So Blood Will Out, which we see an image from here, sends you into these infuriating kind of random loops of repetition where you have to read the same blocks of description over and over again, and you start making just random choices to just try to move on somehow. It is possible to win this game, but it requires really mostly a lot of luck. And this is an autobiographical game about discovering that your partner is very ill. Obviously, there's a vast difference between playing this game and actually having that happen to you. But the game's writing and its mechanics are designed deliberately to make you feel specific things. even if surely not in the way the game writer felt them when they happened. So more than empathy games, we might think of these narratives as kind of affect engines. Another game where we see this very clearly is Michael Lutz's My Father's Long, Long Legs, which is a horror game in which you were drawn down into the dark to finally face up to a horrible family secret. This is practically a linear story where you don't really get a lot of choices other than to keep clicking to move forward. But the limited interactivity the story gives you is really vital to the way it draws effective and physical responses for you. It allows for the building of tension through timing, as when text takes a while to appear. It allows for the mimicking of the disorientation of exploring a set of tunnels in the dark, as here, where you have to use your mouse as a flashlight in order to see the text. So to conclude, horror is a way of turning up the volume on affect, I think, and horror IF games might be an especially distinct case of this. Obviously, it's not that other genres don't do this. It's more that this genre does it very hard and through very clear, distinct mechanisms. And in this way, I think these texts can encourage the foundational literary skill of tapping into your effective and aesthetic responses. I have a few thoughts when it comes to the ethical dimensions of this, which I might actually leave out just because I feel like we've had so much discussion of this already, but it is certainly something that's on my mind when I work with this kind of material. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely fantastic paper. So next up we have Phil Claydon. So Phil is one of mine and Laura's colleagues here at the University of Hertfordshire. Phil is a film director, screenwriter and senior lecturer in film production at the University of Hertfordshire. He directed the genre films Alone, Lesbian Vampire Killers and Within. His teen horror screenplay Oak is in post-production, directed by Kevin Lewis, who did Willy's Wonderland and The Accused. And Phil's screenplay Toxic is a Screencraft horror finalist. And he's also currently in development with XYZ Films on a teen sci-fi comedy called Lust. So Phil's presentation is in the form of a 5-minute video, which focuses on a case study of one of the assessments that he's implemented at the University of Hertfordshire called the Scare Factor. So I think if he hasn't already, Phil's going to drop the link to that in the chat.
There's the link.
Awesome, thank you. I don't know if you wanted to do like a quick little introduction to it.
Yeah, this is just, it was set in a video, but when I came into the University of Hertfordshire, I just noticed with the short films by the filmmakers that there's a disconnect between the movies that they were making and the impact it was having on the audience. And the best genre to get across or use a skill set to have an immediate response from an audience and to gauge a response from an audience is horror. And being a big horror fan, I figured this is a good way to crowbar it into a module, which was just newly validated this year, which I was put in charge of. So it was like, there's no horror in this. So I think
Let's put some on.
I'll add some.
Cool. All right.
Hello, I'm Phil Claydon and welcome to The Scare Factor. I bet you're asking, what's the scare factor?
Yes?
It's a practical, formative assignment I set for my Level 5 production module, designed to give film students a deeper understanding of the connection between cinematic language and the impact it has on an audience. Their challenge was to make a scary 3-minute short film and see who has the scare factor. I made it formative because nothing scares a student more than the fear of a graded assignment. I gave a concise set of learning outcomes. 1, observe with knowledge and reflect upon how a filmic technique and structure can create a jump scare. 2, gain a basic understanding of how a scare scene is constructed. And 3, identify how visual storytelling with shot composition and sound design can manipulate an audience's emotion. Why horror and why this assignment? Films need to connect with an audience. They have to feel. If they don't, there's no connection. As Peter Guber states, today, everyone, whether they know it or not, is in the emotional transportation business. The students need to think about the audience. As Steven Spielberg states, I always like to think of the audience when I'm directing, because I am the audience. Horror films have a direct contract with the audience. They expect to feel the following: scared, shocked, anxious, tense, uneasy, uncomfortable. Fear is universal. It's a biological fact. Horror films elicit a visceral physical response. The heart rate quickens, adrenaline is released, the brain is in fight or flight mode. It's tense and ready to survive. This heightened state in a safe space is what horror promises and what the filmmaker is contracted to deliver. How is this achieved? In a series of short lectures exploring film and the audience, the students will learn that scares don't happen by chance or fluke, but by design. To craft a scare piece, the students need to grasp the basic fundamentals of storytelling. As C. Robert Cargill states, a good jump scare is a magic trick.
Would you like to see a magic trick?
Yeah.
It's a cinematic sleight of hand. You get the audience to look over there, creating suspense, and when they least expect it, you hit them from somewhere else. It is about the setup, the pledge, a protagonist investigating a strange noise or incident. The misdirect, the turn. The character finds a simple explanation and the threat is neutralized. And then, the scare, the prestige, hit the audience with something surprising from somewhere they least suspect it. Okay, great scary idea written, but that's right, it's a visual and oral experience. Shot choice, composition, lighting, editing and sound all have to be banging the right tune for the scares to work. By deconstructing how the masters like Steven Spielberg, Alfred Hitchcock, John Carpenter and James Wan craft their scare pieces, the students will learn to think and plan what shots are needed to create the effect. How a wide shot creates negative space and focuses the audience attention away from where the threat will attack. How a medium shot can contract the audience's field of view, making them feel uneasy about what lurks at the edge of the frame. And how a simple pan and tilt can be used to terrifying effect. And what sounds will be needed to create this effect. Audiences need to hear the fear. It's important to understand the importance of prep. Prep is key in figuring out the how, the why a sequence of shots will work using storyboards, animatics and pre-visualizations. They need to have everything figured out and know why they are doing it for what impact on the audience. The students should be inspired by success stories from the world of horror shorts. The recent horror hit Smile was directed by Parker Finn and it came from his short film Laura Hasn't Slept. David Sandberg's short horror Lights Out was spotted by James Wan, and now he's directing Shazam. And Jennifer Kent went from The Monster to The Babadook. Horror is fertile ground for up-and-coming filmmakers to get noticed and make an impact. Learning these cinematic techniques gets the students into the mindset of creating a moment. And film is all about moments that connect from story to screen to audience. From this assignment, they will be able to take this visual storytelling language into their future films, whether it's a drama, comedy, or thriller.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions for Phil or for Erika, if you could hold on to them till we open the floor for questions, that would be fantastic. But next up, our third and final speaker is Dean Lockwood. So Dean is a senior lecturer in the School of Film, Media and Journalism at the University of Lincoln. He authored with Rob Coley the books Cloud Time and Photography in the Middle, Dispatches on Media, Ecologies and Aesthetics. Dean is currently working on a monograph all about weird fiction in relation to media theory for the University of Wales Press's Horror Studies series. And he also runs undergraduate modules which deal with issues relevant to horror studies, including the modules Horror in Popular Culture and Eco-Media, as well as the postgraduate module, which forms part of the focus of his proposal today. So Dean's paper is titled What Thinks in Me is Outside Me, excuse me, Teaching Eco-Horror with Upstream Color. So whenever you're ready, Dean.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint.
Yeah, can see it.
Okay, so my postgraduate module, Human and Inhuman in the 21st Century, deals with the culture of the Anthropocene, the current epoch in which human action upon the earth has entailed ecological crisis and jeopardizing life. With a strong emphasis on horror and the weird, students are invited to interrogate human attitudes to the non-human. And the module presents students with a series of provocations to which they have to respond experimentally, essentially, through developing their own treatments of existing fictions, either written or involving various forms of media practice. And one such provocation entails responding to Shane Carruth's film, Upstream Color from 2013, which I would argue can be conceived as an eco-horror film. With interesting implications for thinking about narrative and character. I'll talk briefly on eco-horror in general before I move on to the film in particular, and then I'll close with some remarks on the module and its assignment. Okay, so although a horror of nature has long been manifest in horror literature, eco-horror as such is usually identified as a subgenre of horror cinema, which became established in the 70s. At that time, the subgenre responded to growing awareness of environmental issues and centered most typically on the revenge of the natural world, framed as blowback against a human race, which had hubristically set itself up as the master of the earth. Monstrous nature was typically framed as them, insects, animals, or plants against us. Gradually, however, more sophistication was evidenced. So David Cronenberg's The Fly from 1986, in which an errant scientist inadvertently splices his DNA with that of a housefly, foregrounds the instability and metamorphic potential of the human body. A body that materially ceases to be ours and is revealed as a changeful alien thing, open to uncontrollable becomings. In the 21st century, some eco-horror movies, such as the film in question today, pose an even more obscure ecological fluidity that challenges the deep-seated sense of a natural world existing in clear distinction from human society. This development reflects a sense of unease with traditional environmentalist discourses of resilience and sustainability. Such discourses, privileging equilibrium and balance, indicate a primary aim of making the world safe for humans. And I think this discourse has been easily co-opted by capitalism and translated within its terms. Thinking ecologically rather than environmentally, however, entails a more radical challenge to the deeply entrenched distinction between the human and the non-human. Environmentalism simply doesn't do enough to unseat the notion of a stable human here against a realm over there, a totally different dimension called away, as Timothy Morton puts it, into which we can flush all that threatens to undermine our security. Ecological thought beyond environmentalism emphasizes a certain disanthropocentrization, foregrounding dynamic relations in a web of agents and forces, both human and non-human, existing in radical interconnectedness or entanglement, any one part multiply connected and obligated to its multiple connections. There is no away. In fact, as Morton argues, we're only now beginning to acknowledge that we've created massively distributed entities, or as he calls them, hyperobjects, such as climate change, plastic and nuclear waste, which we've been unable to throw away, which press upon us ever more insistently. Hyperobjects are so vast that they can't be grasped in their totality and directly represented. Anthropocene culture for Morton is best conceived in terms of human reaction shots to eco-crisis, visceral affective experiences of immersion and entanglement with hyperobjects. In my module, I'm suggesting to students that 21st century eco-horror cinema can be usefully conceived as an Anthropocene reaction shot, foregrounding the hyper-objective weirdness which characterizes contemporary ecological awareness. Donna Haraway has captured something of this weirdness in her notion of sympoiesis. Sympoiesis, she says, is a simple word. It means making with. Nothing makes itself, nothing is really autopoetic or self-organizing. We're never formed in isolation. We have to reconcile ourselves to permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints. Human exceptionalism for Haraway is a discredited fantasy. Instead, we're entwined in and undone by abyssal and dreadful graspings, frayings, and weavings. So here, Haraway is intimating the dread which can accompany an ecological sensibility, as in Eugene Thacker's notion of a nature which courses through self and world without aim or end, indifferent to the self's possessive individualism and the species' sense of superiority. And Thacker cites the philosopher Ian Hamilton Grant, "What thinks in me is outside me." We're exiled into a strange realm in which what we hitherto supposed to be our thoughts are revealed as infected with the traces of an intrusive, non-rational, predatory, or parasitic agency. The default response to my screening of Upstream Color from students has been a mild contempt, it has to be said, for what they perceive as its impenetrability and perhaps pretentiousness. So I begin by challenging that. The film is certainly unusual, but can we push further with what is odd about it in seminar discussion? The film troubles coherence of self and world, and part of this rests in the mixing up of generic expectations. So as evidence of this, we look at the reversible DVD sleeve, which suggests on one side, on the left here, the tale of a troubled romance, perhaps a folie à deux, or on the other side, a weird, horrific Cronenbergian tale of parasitic infection. More than this, though, the film resists what students typically expect by way of narrative exposition. It's been described as a puzzle film in which it becomes a struggle to force events into intelligible stories. And this is compounded by the film's affective strategies. For example, dialogue is muted, backgrounded in favor of sounds and textures. What carries audiences is not language or cognitive sense, but rather the auditory, haptic, and corporeal experience the film presents. Often the film dramatizes this as an experience of immersion in water or as a descent into the bodily interior. Sound and touch, rather than vision, orient and direct the experience. The film encourages a felt visceral sense of events and their connections, fostering bodily sympathy. Upstream Color, by these means, discourages confident synoptic elucidation. Nevertheless, it can be deduced that the film provides glimpses of various stages in the life cycle of a hyper-objective entity, which is also an artificial ecosystem. And because all of the stages are subject to monetization, it's also a form of capital. Events are focalized for us through the experience of a woman, Chris. Chris is abducted from a nightclub and compelled to ingest a preparation containing a worm. You can see the worm here in the body in the current slide. One of the incarnations of the entity is this worm that's found only on the leaves and roots of a particular blue orchid growing on the banks of a particular river. The worm's influence plunges Chris into a fugue in which she is rendered susceptible to her captor's suggestions. Distracting her with busy work such as making paper chains, her captor eventually convinces her to withdraw all of her funds from her bank and hand it over to him. Once the thief has abandoned her, Chris becomes confused and now frightened by the worm moving through her body. But she's then subject to the controlling influence of a further captor, an entrepreneurial artist referred to as the sampler, who sends out a pulsing sound through the ground, which acts to charm and lure the worm within Chris, and by extension, Chris herself. The sampler then carries out a procedure in which he transfers the worm in Chris's body into the body of a pig. He's also a pig farmer. She's then abandoned by him, and she returns to her home, now jobless, destitute, and amnesic. The pig the sampler has infected goes on to produce the blue substance that will then enter the river and affect the orchids, which will be host to the next generation of worms. And we assume that the cycle then begins again. Having been parasitized in this way, Chris can no longer be sure of herself or her memories. Upstream Color, in disclosing this chain of dependencies, challenges the fantasy of a bounded, self-made individual. Identity is compromised by the claims of others in this cycle, and the self is essentially rendered uncanny. Chris remains opened out to forces beyond the individual. For example, she's bewildered by her thoughts and feelings as she continues to be sensitive to the existence of the pig into which her worm was migrated. Happening to meet and begin a relationship with Jeff, another of the sampled, she finds she cannot distinguish her own childhood memories from his. And together, they contrive to piece together their infection ordeal, remembering it through visceral compulsions to return to the busy work routines of making paper chains and so on. And through the affective resonances this creates, Chris is eventually able to recall the role of the sampler character and then to locate and kill him in order to hopefully destroy the cycle and retake control of her own life. At first, the film's conclusion may well appear to comprise a happy ending. Chris and Jeff communicate with all those who've been sampled and are able to restore their memories. Acting in concert, the group take ownership of the sampler's farm and communicate with their familiars, the pigs. And we're seeing here Chris snuggling up with her pig familiar. Carruth, the director, though, pins his hopes on our pushing beyond this. When the sample take ownership of the process, they extract or force a narrative shape, a sense of peace and reconciliation from the chain of influences. And we as audiences may initially feel that this wraps up and ties off the film's ecology quite nicely. But Carruth in interviews suggests that we are left actually with nothing more than just another partial or false fabulation. The tagline of the film is telling: you can force your story's shape, but the color will always bloom upstream. What thinks in you is outside you. It's a color blooming upstream, awareness of which is foreclosed to all that exists downstream. Snuggling with her pig, Chris is effectively truncating the exploration of a new kind of subjectivity that she and Jeff began. She appears to have recovered the world, but we're nevertheless left with a sense of the ineradicable insufficiency of our compulsive narrativization of self, the world, and the real. Upstream Color, I suggest to students, posits a dereliction or insufficiency of narrative, which works against the expectation that a story must be brought home to the conclusion that the world is finally meaningful in human terms. So here are a few slides which are extracts from the module assignment brief. So this is part of the second experiment in the module. Discussing the film, I invite students to consider the ways in which in the film, an ecological perspective compels a re-evaluation of storytelling, suggesting that stories of self and world are liable to become weirded, estranged, compelled to sprawl beyond our grasp as we acknowledge our entanglement with non-human agencies. And the point is underlined by Haraway, who says, storying cannot any longer be put into the box of human exceptionalism. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has written that to compose ecologically is to build in openness and therefore vulnerability. To think disanthropocentrically is to shift beyond the green of environmentalism towards a complex, many-hued ecological sensibility. So the problem here for this module is, can students, inspired by Upstream Color, select their own examples of familiar narratives and alter, skew them or inflect them in various ways through a narrative treatment, working on a series of images, posters, an advertising campaign, and so on, to imagine a narrative composition that builds in openness, that estranges the human story of the world. Of the responses to this assignment brief, the weaker student responses have tended to merely appropriate and re-edit trailers, largely from post-apocalyptic movies, to simply strip them of representations of the human. So, for example, one effort took a trailer for the biblical epic Noah and simply edited out all of the human characters and the ark. I try to encourage less literal, less naive notions of what disanthropocentrization might entail. It's not about cultivating a pretense that we can simply escape our human perspective and stand down from our role in the making of the world. But instead, and as Cohen puts it, it's an attempt to render human centrality a problem rather than a starting point. The stronger student responses have understood this, and they engage more closely with this challenge of the experiment. So just one example. One student reconceived a Jane Austen narrative as a pheromonal drama, privileging not the conscious ruminations of the human characters, but the agency of their various bodily secretions in stimulating sexual attraction. In conclusion, then, I suggest that the pedagogical value of this exercise, this screening and discussion of Upstream Color, is to both teach the potential complexity and sophistication of eco-horror cinema, and simultaneously what eco-horror cinema affords with respect to the cultivation of a radical ecological sensibility, an ecological storytelling rather than an ego-logical storytelling, if you like. And I think that this encourages students to think beyond the perspectival chauvinism that is often entailed by traditional forms of storytelling. Okay, so thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Dean. That was really, really interesting. All right, so like I said earlier, the panel is probably going to run a little bit shorter than was stated in the program schedule, but if anyone does have any questions, for any of the panelists, if you want to stick your hand up or if you want to type those into the chat now, that would be fantastic. Sorry, I'm just having a look. We've already got a question in there, so I'll go straight ahead and ask that. Kate, I don't know if you want to ask it yourself or if you want me to get it from the chat. Okay. Oh, I'll ask it then. All right, so Kate asks, bear with me 1 second. So this is a question. Oh, sorry, Kate, I saw that you had a question. I didn't see that you said you wanted me to read it out. So a question for Phil. She really enjoyed your film, and scare factor assessment sounds great in terms of getting filmmakers to think about their engagement with the audience. So she just wanted to ask, does the assessment also encourage students to change or revise the techniques you discuss with them so they can innovate and come up with original approaches to the jump scare?
I think absolutely. I mean, every filmmaker out there has to innovate and change. The formula is always the same. Like, you can analyze every jump scare and every suspense sequence. It has a certain set of set beats that are there with everything, which you should understand and know. And then the question is, how do you rearrange and present those to an audience in a way where you're ahead of them? It's the same as I said, like a magic trick. So it's like, you can use a pan and a tilt, you can use it as a misdirect, or you can use it as a reveal. You can use a wide shot. You can hold on a wide shot for as long as possible, like The Exorcist 3. It's just different ways that they got to employ those ideas. And the key that they've really got to think about is how are they going to use that to misdirect their audience and to lead them where they want to. Because at the moment, obviously, they're having trouble connecting with an audience. So this, only through practice will they be able to see what works or what fails. But it's about sticking to what the formula is, because it's the formula that gets the result. But within that, where do you go? What idea do you come up with? Where do you set it? How do you use what already exists to change it around?
Thank you. I think Laura had her hand up.
Hello. I've got a question for Phil, and I've also got a question for Erika, if it's not too cheeky. So I'll let you decide whether I'm allowed to or not as chair, Shellie. But they're not related. So I'll go to Phil first, because he's just been speaking and it's a quick one, and then I'll come to Erika. Phil, thank you for that really fantastic presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it sounds like a fantastic assessment. I know we've talked about it before, and I'm really glad you're doing it. Obviously, I know that you're still in the process. Students are still in the process of working on this, right? But I just wondered what their response to it had been so far. You talked a lot about the assessment itself and kind of the construction of the scare and what have you. But I just wondered how students had actually responded to it so far.
To be honest with you, engagement has been very, very low, and I think that just comes because it's the first year of doing it and it's the placement of where I set it up. So I talked about it at the start of the semester when everyone's kind of fresh and excited. And obviously, as we know, it's jamming into kind of like 3 other assessments at the end of the year. So the best way to do it, I'll revise it next year, and we'll actually do it as a kind of formative assessment that has kind of like a short start of term kind of 3-week window on it. So this year I've done kind of like 1 minute film that they shoot on their iPhone, and I'll replace that next year, and I'll do it as they go out and make a short horror film.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. It's a shame, really, because I think it's such a kind of innovative way of getting them thinking. And as you said, it did make me laugh at the beginning when you said it's formative, because nothing scares a student more than a summative assignment. I really like that. And I think it's a really good opportunity for them. And it's this, I think it's such a shame that, students often ask for more opportunities for feedback and more opportunities to create things without being assessed on it. And then when we do offer formative opportunities, the engagement and the take-up is quite low.
As you know, Laura, the feedback when I came in, because obviously I was a visiting lecturer, and then this year I started as a senior lecturer on this module. And when I arrived, the main thing was that all the students, their main feedback is like, oh, we thought we'd be making more films. And as all my colleagues and yourself said, they've got constant access. They're always pushed to go and make their own films. So I was like, well, let's set up some formative assessments and see how that works. So even when they kind of got a framework there, at least we can say, well, you could have gone and made a scary 3-minute film, and it's your decision whether you want to. But it's just a question, I think, of like focusing their mind. It's like it's too long a period to start at the start of term and do it at the end. So I'm going to do it as a short period of time. I know in animation they got this great thing where they do a previs thing, and it's like a solid week to come up with a 30-second previs where they start with the idea, and by the end of, they start on one Monday, by the following Monday they've got a previs with sound and everything of how the film will be, and then they go on to make that film at the end of the semester. So I may take that idea on, as in terms of, even if you don't shoot it, previs, come up with the idea, work on that aspect of the cinematic language you're going to use, and then they might be able to take that on into kind of, say, the fiction actual assignment.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So I mean, lots of opportunities for refining it next year, but I think a really good starting point though.
Yeah
Cool.
Laura, do you want to ask your question of Erika?
Yeah, Erika, apologies in advance, because I appreciate this wasn't really what you were talking about, but the choose your own adventure kind of story, the one about illness. I just wanted to ask how your students had responded to that, particularly in terms of kind of horror and trauma, because I know Shellie obviously talked about trauma a little bit earlier, so apologies because I know this isn't your area of specialism, but I just wondered kind of how students had responded to those kind of themes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's totally relevant. So this particular game is it has this content warning screen on it where it sort of says this is written to be upsetting. It's intended to upset you. Please don't play it, essentially. Like,
that's interesting.
You don't have to have the experience that I had, in a way, is sort of what the author says. And for that reason, and for a bunch of other reasons, this isn't something I use as an obligatory text. I only ever, quite often when I'm doing interactive fiction, I have kind of a range of different texts that students, or different games that students can work with. And I do like a little write-up of each of them and sort of explain kind of what the vibe is and what content elements they might want to be aware of and so on. And yeah, that's very much one of the ones where I try to make it clear what the students are in for, because I think if you had any real life experience of that at all, I think it would be an awful experience to play.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine so. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think Aaron had his hand up. Aaron, do you want to come on screen?
Yeah, thank you. Can I be heard? Am I? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Everything was brilliant. It was just I was thinking on what Dean was talking about. I was wondering. I wonder how much of horror's place in academic film studies now can be traced back to that kind of turn towards embodiment and haptics and things like this, which to me still feels really recent, but I suppose it was a fair while ago. And also I was wondering if that might be an in for students who otherwise maybe wouldn't necessarily want to engage with horror, because again, in my experience, Laura Marks and Vivian Sobchak and people like this, students get quite excited about that stuff, and horror seems like a perfect place to be thinking through things to do with embodiment and affect and whatnot. And I just wondered if that might be what people's experience was with that. If that makes sense. That made more sense in my head than it did come out of me.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. The module occurs within a program. It's Media and Cultural Studies. And elsewhere on the program, we're talking about affective analysis. So we look at Marx and so on. And students have an opportunity to carry out their own affective analyses in discussion in workshops. And we also cover on the same module, Deleuze and Guattari, notions of becoming, assemblage theory. And I found that in the module I've been talking about today, through these experiments, it's a really good opportunity to use the horror genre in order to bear out some of those claims that we've been making about affect and assemblage and becoming, and students really get to see in a kind of hands-on way how they can start to begin manipulating and extending those concepts in their own thinking. And horror, I mean, many people have said today in papers so far about the affective ways in which the horror genre works. And I think there's a perfect match here between affective analysis and new inroads into thinking about ecology and the environment. So all of this meshes together, and I don't know if it would be as successful we're taking other films as an example, but Upstream Color certainly plays very well into all of this. And one of the things I enjoy teaching Upstream Color is the ways in which their initial resistance to the film is gradually broken down as they begin to see how they can apply approaches to affective analysis and ecological thinking. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Aaron. While we're waiting, I don't know if anyone has any other questions, if you want to put those in the chat if you do. But I thought it might be interesting to, if any of the panelists have any questions for the other panelists. I don't know if you do, but if you do have any, this might be the time to ask them before we run out of time. No?
Nothing is immediately coming to mind.
That's fair enough.
This has been so interesting.
No,
yeah.
I just thought I'd give you the chance if you wanted to. I did have a question of my own for Phil. So like today we've been talking a lot about student resistance to horror as part of modules, but I wondered if you had experienced any resistance to horror as a form of assessment, even though it's a formative assessment, it being kind of not an option that they can do, but kind of the focus of an assessment, if you'd experienced any resistance to that and how you kind of managed that.
Yeah, I had no resistance. In actual fact, the students were really quite excited about the assessment when we first, because I'd done it within kind of like a half an hour lecture where I explained what it was going to be and what they were set up to do. And they seemed quite excited about kind of like having those sort of guidelines to try and, jump there to choose their friends. So I think they kind of like that format. Bizarrely, I don't really give too much disclaimers with my stuff because I think they all know I'm sort of a big horror fan, and I've been doing these kind of like shorts, showing a load of shorts to level 6s and deconstructing those. And I usually just start the day. It's 9 in the morning, everyone's tired, and I just press play where it goes on the big screen in the forum. We got this huge LED screen, and about 70% of them have been thrillers, sci-fi and horror. So, and there really hasn't been any resistance, whether they're just too tired or whether it wakes them up, but they all feel something. It starts a big discussion, and they will get the feeling of like, oh, that really upset me, and it's that thing about it's made you feel something. And that is your job as a filmmaker. If I put something up and you fell asleep, we're not interested. It's your job to engage us. So resistance has been minimal at the moment.
Cool.
Also, I think it's because my level 5 are a very quiet cohort.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that's because it's a post-COVID thing, but I've not just from myself, but other people that have been working with them say they're quite a quiet bunch.
Yeah.
So it's hard to gauge.
Cool. All right. Thank you. I think we've got another question in the chat from Thomas. So Thomas asks, have Shane Carruth's recent off-screen controversies become part of the context in which you teach Upstream Color, Dean?
Yeah, a good question. They haven't been part of the context because I've only recently become aware of them myself. So, but I am, and it is slightly troubling, and maybe that there are ways in which that deserves to be incorporated to some extent in the discussions. Yeah, but I not hitherto, but maybe in the future I should incorporate some kind of opportunity for students to discuss that.